The cranes at Qingdao just stopped moving. Cargo ships sit stranded off China's coast, each one carrying the minerals that keep America's military alive. Then, overnight, Beijing pulls the trigger. No rare earth exports, no exceptions. Within hours, United States defense suppliers freeze production. The Pentagon calls it sabotage. Beijing calls it policy. But the numbers don't lie. 78% of America's weapons now depend on materials China controls. Fighter jets, missiles, radar systems, all built on the one resource Washington no longer controls. And the question hitting every war room tonight is simple. How do you fight a superpower when it can cut off your ammunition at the port? Within an hour, traders in New York begin calling it Beijing's silent embargo. The timing isn't accidental. 2 days before Donald Trump and Xi Jinping were scheduled to meet in Seoul, China's Ministry of Commerce expanded its export controls, adding 5 more rare earth elements to the restricted list. According to Reuters, the move now covers 12 critical elements and dozens of categories of mining and refining equipment. Beijing defended the decision as a national security measure. The markets read it as something else, a message. Trump, informed mid-flight, slammed his hand on the armrest. They waited until now, he said, according to one aide present. They want leverage at the table. The Wall Street Journal reported that the president immediately ordered his trade team to prepare a new round of 100% tariffs in retaliation. But tariffs are slow weapons. China's controls, by contrast, took effect overnight. Behind the technical language of export licenses lies the core of the crisis. China processes over 90% of the world's rare earths, the metals used in precision-guided missiles, radar systems, fighter jet engines, and the electric motors that power drones and submarines. The United States can mine some of these materials at home, but it cannot yet refine them at scale. As the Financial Times put it, the bottleneck is not the mine, it's the refinery. That distinction now threatens to paralyze the United States military-industrial base. A newly released study by Gavini, a defense analytics firm that tracks the Pentagon's supply chain, revealed that more than 80,000 individual components across nearly 1,900 U.S. weapon systems depend on Chinese-sourced minerals. That's 78% of all Department of Defense platforms. The report breaks it down further. The U.S. Navy depends on China for 92% of the minerals in its weapon systems, the Air Force 85%, and the Army about 70%. The conclusion is stark. If Beijing tightens the tap, Washington's arsenal runs dry. Consider the F-35, America's most advanced fighter jet. According to Bloomberg, each one contains nearly 900 pounds of rare earth elements. They're in the jet's guidance systems, sensors, and flight controls. Even if the U.S. could source the raw ores elsewhere, they would still need to be refined, almost always in China. Australia and Canada have deposits, but they still send ore to Chinese refineries for separation. That's the real trap. Mining is geology. Processing is monopoly. When China announced export restrictions on graphite in 2023, the world treated it as an energy story. But that policy became the blueprint for something larger. The 2025 expansion to include lithium-ion batteries, synthetic diamonds, and key rare earths shows how Beijing can convert industrial supply chains into geopolitical pressure points. The United States, by contrast, has spent decades outsourcing its own. In the 1980s, Washington shut down its largest rare earth facility at Mountain Pass, California, after Chinese producers undercut global prices. By the time the mine reopened decades later, China had already built a refining network so vast that rebuilding an American equivalent would take a generation. This week's restrictions reveal how that asymmetry becomes power. The Wall Street Journal notes that Beijing's new rules even apply to foreign companies using Chinese origin materials, meaning a magnet built in South Korea or Germany could still fall under Chinese export jurisdiction if any of its inputs were processed in China. That extraterritorial reach isn't just legal friction, it's a strategic filter that lets Beijing decide, case by case, who gets what and when. Inside the Pentagon, logistics officers are running silent war games, not about tanks or missiles, but about supply chain choke points. One scenario imagines a month-long freeze on Chinese rare earth shipments. Within 6 weeks, missile guidance production halts. Within 8, aircraft radar assembly lines slow. Within 12, Navy propulsion systems face component shortages. The numbers are drawn from the Defense Logistics Agency's own dependency assessments. But Beijing's position isn't simple aggression. Chinese officials argue that they are merely responding to U.S. restrictions on advanced semiconductor exports. As Reuters quoted the Ministry of Commerce, "Our measures are defensive and legitimate." The logic follows the same pattern. Washington blocked chips, Beijing blocks minerals. Both claim national security. Both weaponize interdependence. Let's pause here, because the issue isn't just about who supplies the metals, it's about who can afford the delay. A license held for 60 days can idle an entire U.S. production line. Factories operate on just-in-time procurement. They aren't built for strategic standoffs. And, Beijing's licensing process is opaque by design. Even friendly nations like Germany and Japan must apply for permission, with no guarantee of approval or timeline. Meanwhile, China has learned how to calibrate pain. When the United States restricted chip exports, Beijing didn't retaliate with blanket bans. Instead, it introduced deliberate ambiguity, rules that are flexible enough to enforce politically, but firm enough to scare markets. That uncertainty alone raises prices. According to Bloomberg data, the global price of neodymium oxide, critical for military-grade magnets, has climbed 22% since the announcement. The Financial Times reports automakers paying premiums of up to 20% for non-Chinese suppliers in Vietnam and Estonia. The problem is, those suppliers ultimately buy feedstock from China too. The more Washington tries to diversify, the more it discovers that the entire system leads back to the same ports. And yet, the rare earth crisis is not just a story of dependence, it's one of delayed realization. For years, U.S. defense officials insisted that stockpiles and allies would prevent vulnerabilities. But, stockpiles deplete, and allies need licenses too. Japan, South Korea, and Germany all import Chinese processed materials. Even Canada's nascent refining projects rely on Chinese equipment. As the Wall Street Journal observed, China's export rules now cover not only minerals but also the machines that make them usable. Washington's response has been urgent, but honestly kind of fragmented. Under the Defense Production Act, the Trump administration has allocated billions to expand domestic refining and magnet manufacturing. MP Materials, the company operating the Mountain Pass mine, has received federal contracts to build a U.S.-based processing plant. But scaling that capacity takes years. The Pentagon has also begun stockpiling antimony, gallium, and tungsten under its Strategic Materials Reserve, aiming for a 12-month buffer. Yet even with these measures, Govini's report concluded that no near-term substitute exists for Chinese capacity. Halfway through the summit in Seoul, Chinese state media released a one-line statement. Licensing will continue according to national needs. Markets instantly interpreted national needs as, geopolitical leverage. Trump's advisors urged him to walk out. Instead, he demanded that the U.S. Trade Representative prepare retaliatory tariffs targeting $120 billion of Chinese goods, including magnets, EV components, and battery metals. Beijing's response was measured. It reminded Washington that China's restrictions are not bans. But, the difference between a ban and a license delay can be the same thing when you build fighter jets. The Financial Times reported that China's magnet exports dropped nearly 15% year over year by mid-2025. That number is not symbolic. It's physical evidence of control. Shipments slowed not because factories stopped, but because paperwork did. This brings us to the core question no one in Washington can yet answer. How does a superpower fight a trade war when its missiles depend on the other side's minerals? By September, the Pentagon's Internal Task Force on Critical Materials submitted a classified recommendation, later summarized by Reuters, urging the creation of a Western Rare Earth Reserve, a coordinated stockpile managed by the US, Japan, and the EU. The idea mirrors the International Energy Agency's oil reserves, collective security through shared supply. But coordination requires trust, and even allies now compete for the same shipments. Beijing, for its part, insists that the West is overreacting. Its officials frame the restrictions as a safeguard against misuse. Yet the timing, days before the Trump-Xi meeting, suggests otherwise. China's leverage is economic, not military, but its effects may be longer lasting than any missile test. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense has begun auditing every contract for exposure to Chinese inputs. According to Bloomberg's reporting, the process revealed something few anticipated. Even the tools used to manufacture semiconductors for defense electronics often rely on tungsten and gallium sourced from China. Dependency runs deeper than material. It extends to manufacturing DNA. The United States spent decades believing it could separate economic efficiency from strategic risk. That illusion cracked in a warehouse full of silent cranes. Now, every Pentagon budget meeting includes a new line item: mineral resilience. Congress debates subsidies for refining plants in Texas, California, and Saskatchewan. Private companies lobby for tax credits to build magnet factories. But supply chains built over 30 years can't be repatriated in 3. In the meantime, China plays a longer game. According to the Financial Times, Beijing has expanded its strategic materials stockpile to record levels, storing not only rare earths but also copper, nickel, and lithium. It is building redundancy before conflict, not after. Trump's national security advisors have begun to draw parallels with OPEC in the 1970s. Except this time, the resource isn't oil, it's control over industrial civilization's base layer. By late September, U.S. defense contractors began rationing production schedules. Raytheon postponed deliveries of certain radar components, citing, supply chain disruptions. Lockheed Martin quietly shifted procurement priorities toward available materials, even if performance metrics dipped a bit. These are not market adjustments. They are strategic concessions. Still, the White House insists that America will, quote, end dependence. Officials point to new projects in Australia, Canada, and even Brazil, where U.S. investment has really surged. But as Bloomberg's energy correspondent noted, processing capacity remains the bottleneck. Even if every new mine starts tomorrow, most ore would still need to pass through Chinese refiners. China doesn't need to ban exports outright. It only needs to manage the faucet. And the number that haunts every room in the Pentagon remains unchanged. 78% of America's military hardware still runs on Chinese minerals. That statistic isn't just an embarrassment, it's a structural vulnerability measured in tons, volts, and seconds. The question no analyst can answer yet is simple, terrifying, and real. When one office in Beijing controls the minerals that make America's weapons possible, how many shipments stand between deterrence and dependence? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.